The story of Al-Shabaab's rise to prominence begins in the tumultuous years following the collapse of the Somali central government in 1991. With the disintegration of state authority, Somalia plunged into a state of lawlessness and chaos, becoming a breeding ground for various armed factions vying for power and control. In the absence of a functioning government, clan-based militias emerged as the de facto rulers of different regions, perpetuating cycles of violence and instability. Amidst this power vacuum, Islamist groups began to gain traction, capitalizing on widespread disillusionment with the prevailing order and offering an alternative vision of governance rooted in Sharia law. One such group was Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, formed in the early 1990s with the aim of establishing an Islamic state in Somalia. Although Al-Ittihad initially focused on charitable activities and social services, its agenda soon turned militant as it became embroiled in armed conflict with rival factions and engaged in acts of terrorism. As Al-Ittihad's influence grew, so too did the concerns of neighboring countries and the international community, who viewed the group as a destabilizing force in the region. In response, efforts were made to curb its activities and dismantle its infrastructure. But these measures only served to fragment the organization, giving rise to splinter groups and new alliances. Among the factions that emerged from the ashes of Al-Ittihad was Al-Shabaab, which would eventually surpass its predecessor in both scope and scale of operations. Founded in the mid-2000s, Al-Shabaab initially positioned itself as a resistance movement against the Ethiopian intervention in Somalia and the Transitional Federal Government (TFG) supported by the West. Under the leadership of individuals like Aden Hashiero and Ahmed Abdi Gadain, Al-Shabaab adopted a more radical and extremist ideology, attracting disaffected youth and exploiting tribal grievances to bolster its ranks. Its message of resistance against foreign intervention and promises of justice and stability resonated with many Somalis who had grown weary of years of conflict and insecurity. As Al-Shabaab's influence spread, so too did its reign of terror. The group carried out assassinations, bombings, and attacks on government institutions and foreign interests, instilling fear and chaos wherever it went. Its brutal tactics earned it a reputation as one of the most feared and formidable militant groups in the region, capable of striking with impunity and exacting a heavy toll on its adversaries. In the years that followed, Al-Shabaab would continue to grow in strength and audacity, challenging the authority of the Somali government and spreading its influence far beyond the borders of Somalia. But as its power expanded, so too did the resolve of those who stood against it, determined to stem the tide of extremism and reclaim their homeland from the shadows of strife. As Al-Shabaab solidified its grip on power, its reign of terror spread like wildfire across Somalia and beyond. With ruthless efficiency, the militant group imposed its strict interpretation of Sharia law, enforcing its draconian decrees with brutal violence and intimidation. In urban centers like Mogadishu, Al-Shabaab established a reign of fear, enforcing its harsh edicts through a network of informants and enforcers. Women were forced to adhere to strict dress codes. Music and entertainment were banned, and dissent was met with swift and merciless punishment. Public executions became a common spectacle, serving as a grim warning to those who dared to oppose the group's authority. In rural areas, Al-Shabaab's presence was even more pervasive, with the group exerting control over every aspect of daily life. Farmers were forced to pay exorbitant taxes or surrender their crops to the militants, while schools were shuttered or repurposed to indoctrinate children with the group's extremist ideology. Those who refused to comply with Al-Shabaab's demands faced the threat of violence or death, their villages razed to the ground as a warning to others. In rural areas, Al-Shabaab's presence was even more pervasive, with the group exerting control over every aspect of daily life. Farmers were forced to pay exorbitant taxes or surrender their crops to the militants, while schools were shuttered or repurposed to indoctrinate children with the group's extremist ideology. Those who refused to comply with Alshabab's demands faced the threat of violence or death, their villages razed to the ground as a warning to others. But perhaps most insidious of all was Al-Shabaab's recruitment of child soldiers, who were indoctrinated from a young age and groomed to become the next generation of fighters. These impressionable youths were subjected to a relentless barrage of propaganda, taught to view violence and martyrdom as noble pursuits, and denied any semblance of a normal childhood. As Al-Shabaab's reign of terror spread, so too did the suffering of the Somali people. Families were torn apart, communities were shattered, and the fabric of society was rent asunder by the relentless onslaught of violence and oppression. And yet, amidst the darkness, there were those who dared to resist, who refused to surrender to the tyranny of extremism. In the face of overwhelming odds, brave men and women across Somalia rose up against Al-Shabaab, risking their lives to challenge the group's authority and reclaim their freedom. Theirs was a struggle fraught with danger and uncertainty, but fueled by an unshakable belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. As the flames of conflict raged on, Somalia stood at a crossroads, torn between the forces of extremism and the yearning for peace and stability. But amidst the chaos and despair, a flicker of hope remained, a beacon of light in the darkest of nights, guiding the way towards a future free from the shadows of terror.